Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to my world. Today our guest is Dr. Heidi Schaeffer. Heidi Schaeffer is a nationally recognized human trafficking awareness and intervention expert. She has educated her emergency department staff and thousands of students and faculty throughout South Florida about human trafficking, collaborated with human trafficking task forces, and served on the executive board human trafficking coalitions. In addition, she has been instrumental in developing and helping to pass victim-focused legislation at local, state, and federal levels, and has twice been invited to speak before the U.S. Congress members in Washington, D.C. That's quite an accomplishment. And Dr. Schaeffer happened to be also a medical doctor, and she's devoting her time to help fight the human trafficking. How many doctors would you know that would walk away from a good practice to do that? That will talk for itself. Now, Dr. Schaeffer, I have a question. It might sound like a very simple question. And the reason I'm going to ask the question is because, and by the way, welcome to my show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're privileged to have you. And it's a simple question, yet it's complicated because when you take the average person, it depends what television show you're watching. Everybody has a different definition of human trafficking. Everybody's an expert. They're not doctors. They read an article in one paper, another paper. So I like to get from a person, not only who's a medical doctor, but also is spending all her time trying to do something about it. What is the definition of human trafficking?
Well, thank you for having me on, Amos. I'm really glad to be here. And thank you for caring about this matter because it is really important. So, yes, there's a lot of confusion about human trafficking, and there's been a lot of films about it. And certainly some of them are very realistic and some of them not so much. But if somebody's talking about human trafficking, I'm happy because at least it's putting it on people's radar. So the legal definition of human trafficking was as established by the TVPA Act back in 2000, and it's a federal act here in the United States. Basically says it's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for either a commercial sex act or another form of forced labor where there has to be an element of force, fraud, or coercion. And there is a distinction when you talk about sex trafficking and labor trafficking. For sex trafficking, the law provides that if someone's under the age of 18, so a minor, they cannot consent. So even though we have that element of force, fraud, or coercion, for prosecutors to prove these cases, it's a little bit easier when you have a child victim who's been sex trafficked, because by definition, they cannot consent. And we've had these cases where we'll have a young girl say, you know what, my boyfriend, he needed new rims, so he sold me to 5 of his friends. And even though she's making an argument that she really wanted to do this and it wasn't coerced, by definition, she can't consent to that. So that's an easy way to understand it. But that's a very long definition. I wouldn't expect anybody to memorize all that except for me, because I happen to be very engaged in this fight. But I will tell you that most people, if they ask me, my one sentence is, what is human trafficking? It's some form of forced labor through exploitation of a vulnerability. And that vulnerability is different for everybody. We know people right now that are probably online looking for love, and we have no idea who they're speaking to on the other side of that screen. Maybe they're not sex traffickers. Maybe they're just, future partners that are really, in their heart of hearts, good people. But the reality is we know a lot of stuff is happening, especially online. And the number one way right now we're seeing kids targeted is by online exploitation. So the long-winded answer to your question is they exploit a vulnerability. They figure out what you want to hear. They tell you it. And then eventually the shoe drops and they expect payment for all the things that they've done for you, which could be very, very little. But to a child who maybe runs away from home, runs straight into the arm of a trafficker, to them, this seems like a lifeline. And, in the beginning, they'll do what they call Romeo pimping. They'll be very nice. And then eventually it switches into this guerrilla pimp, which is a real term, where all of a sudden you see their true colors come out. Kind of akin to domestic violence. Like nobody starts selling these kids or these adults on day one. They're very nice. They kind of string them in. They're charismatic. And then eventually it gets to the point where you see this other side of them. And by then, it's kind of too late for a lot of these victims.
Well, then comes the next question, which is who are the sellers? Who are the buyers? And are there only kids? Are there young ladies? And
Right. Yeah, that's a great question because people have preconceived notions, right? We all think about I hate to say it, the pervert at the playground in a trench coat. We were trained about stranger danger. But the reality is, most of the people that are trafficking in America, first of all, I will say it off the bat, they're American citizens trafficking other American citizens. So even though you'll see movies like Taken where that person is brought across to another country and then trafficked, which does happen, or vice versa, they come into this country seeking a better life and they're trafficked. For the most part, it's happening right here in our own backyards by people that are supposed to be taking care of us. So the buyers, the sellers, and the victims, the answer I give is there is no one profile. It could be, like you said, an adult, it could be a child, it could be black, it could be white, it could be gay, it could be straight, it could be all sorts of spectrum from the socioeconomic status. I know people that, are very well educated and thought this would never happen to them, or they own their own business. And like someone like me, I teach about, trafficking. I also teach about domestic violence. I haven't been trafficked, but I have unfortunately been a victim of domestic violence. And I never thought, knowing everything that I know, that I could be duped. But these are very talented traffickers. And that's the other thing. Just because they're not necessarily all educated with a terminal degree, they're very street smart. And they'll figure out very quickly, okay, Amos, this is what he's missing in his life. I'm going to promise him this. Maybe it's a great job. Maybe it's a love interest, whatever it is. And the next thing you know, you'll get roped in. And by the time you figure out what happened, you're kind of, pretty deep in the hole. So the reality is there is no one profile. So the answer to that question of who's the victim, who's the perpetrator, who's buying and selling, it could be that little old lady that you think, oh my God, women don't buy sex. Boy, I could tell you stories where, we're finding, unfortunately, cases where people say, you know what, I want a 13-year-old virgin boy. And you know what, the demand is there, and the supply will then be supplied by someone who's disgusting enough to fill that need for these people that, of course, think it's okay to hurt people. And I don't really differentiate. Me personally, I hate the fact that so many people have sympathy towards children in this mix, and they don't think about someone over the age of 18 could possibly also be duped. The truth is, most people are duped. I mean, nobody. I go into schools and I'll do a lecture to the little kids, and I make it interactive and developmentally appropriate. And at the end, I'm always like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And fireman, I want to be a ballerina, I want to be president. None of these kids are saying that they want to be raped 25 times a day, which is the average number of times that they're forced to do this when they're a sex trafficking victim. So to me, these kids have all this existing trauma. When they become adults, it's completely understandable that they'd fall into this trap even more than maybe you or I would. So that's the answer to that question. I would say everybody could be a suspect and everybody could be a victim. So just be kind and don't judge.
it reminds me like when people get scammed and you hear them saying, "Oh my God, she was such a nice woman. He was such a nice guy." Well, what do you
Exactly.
expect them to wear a sign? I'm going to scam you, or I'm going
Yes.
to traffic you. In
Yep.
the world, it doesn't work, and it's usually somebody who looks like a
Like
sweet old
us.
man, sweet old woman, and which is
Yeah.
really terrible.
Yeah.
I might be a silly question. Does it happen a lot in Florida, in our state where we live?
Yes. And it happens in every state, so don't feel bad. California and Texas are 1 and 2. We're number 3 in the nation for calls to the
Mhm.
hotline.
Right.
I think it's because Florida actually has a lot of attractive things that get people to come here, right? We're a tourist state. We have a lot of migration. We have a lot of people that have a second home here because we're a tax haven. We don't have a state tax. We also have a lot of wealth. Florida's a generally wealthy state, so people can buy stuff. And like I said before, if they want to buy a commodity, even if that's a 25-year-old woman who's blonde and has a certain breast size, somebody will supply that to her. It's just the sad fact. The other thing that Florida has that people don't think about is we're actually a very big agricultural state. We have a lot of farms. We're the #1 producer of oranges here in the US. Who do you think's picking those crops? That's labor trafficking, or the people that tar the roofs, or the people that work in the hospitality industry. We have a ton of hotels. We're also a big attractant of things like the Super Bowl. We've had two here in the past 5 years. NASCAR, number one event that drives sex trafficking to a certain area is NASCAR. It's actually bigger than the Super Bowl. It doesn't get as much attention, but it should. So we're a real draw. We bring a lot of people in, and people are moving to Florida every day, as you know. Traffic's crazy. The other thing is we have great weather, and people say, "What does weather have to do with it?" Well, I can make someone work in the fields picking crops 24/7 because we have a lot of sunshine. We don't have snow like Buffalo, New York. And if I want to send girls to the tracks and have so many tricks to make money for me as a sex trafficker, they can't do that in snowy New York. No one's going to go out and buy them in the middle of the dead of winter, and certainly they're not going to do well freezing out there because this is a commodity to these traffickers. They don't care about the people at all. They care about how much money can they make. So Florida is a very lucrative place for people to land, and I feel like if it keeps at pace like it is now, we'll eventually overcome either the Texas or the California numbers, because just a couple of years ago, it was actually New York that was third, and we've moved up in the ranks.
Well, let me ask a question. Since we have the open borders and 20 million, depending who you talk to, did you see that trafficking has gone up?
Yes, it's actually a real problem. We've always had an issue with people coming over. They pay money to come over. Generally, there's a coyote involved. And so that's a little bit different. That's another way that people confuse trafficking. They think it's human smuggling. Smuggling is where you want to purposely move and you'll pay somebody to kind of get you across whatever border. Trafficking doesn't require a border, but what happens in those cases, people are using, especially kids right now, we're seeing a lot of abuse of kids being moved back and forth to the border to try to get into this country. And frankly, a lot of these kids are disappearing. We don't know who's even coming into the country, to be fair, right now. It's just a free for all. It's very dangerous. And the numbers of human trafficking, and this is reported across any institution, not just ICE, but the numbers are outstanding for human trafficking. And we need to get a hold of this because if nothing else, if people are coming over seeking a better life, that's great. And we can give that to them, especially if they go through the proper channels. But what's happening is they come over and then they're abused. And here's a great example, and this one's public, so I can share it. A Cuban national, he brought 3 Cuban nationals over, women who wanted to flee Cuba, which has a lot of human rights abuses, so I understood that. And then he promised them this great job when they got over, because instead of paying the 10,000 threshold, which is what they originally had to pay just to get Coyote to cross, he said, "Oh, I need to pay more because I had to do all these extra bribes and had to go through more countries and yada yada." So now their 10,000 became 30 and 40,000. And of course, they have no way to pay that. They don't speak the language. They don't know anybody. They have no skills. This is a foreign country. So I put them to work in sex trafficking. And fortunately, I think 2 of them actually made the quota of 30 and 40,000. You can imagine what their life was like, sleeping with God knows how many people during that interval. But the third one, turned him in and he was prosecuted. So that's a real life example of how even when you think you're coming across a country seeking a better life, someone takes advantage of you, and then you're forced into a situation like labor or sex trafficking.
And that goes back probably thousands of years, except today we're much more sophisticated.
Yes.
It's an iPhone or smartphone. It's a shame we just never learn.
No.
History repeats itself. We are told, if you see something, say something. How do you spot it? Take an average person like me. I'm walking down the street and I see a girl and the guy next to her. Is that his daughter? How does the average person tell? They probably can't, I would imagine.
Well, almost you just said the magical thing. You're thinking, oh, is that his daughter? And you're trying to make a connection. To me, the number one way that we help victims is to have this on our radar, to think about it. Because we're all busy in the average day. Are we looking in the car next to us? Do we see somebody in distress? Even if it's not trafficking, maybe somebody's getting abused, maybe domestic violence, maybe something else is going on. We should be good citizens and want to help each other. So I'm a big fan of if you see something, say something. It's something that I actually, in every lecture presentation, the number one thing I tell people, if you remember nothing else, because I talk fast and I get excited. And to be honest, this is a short show, so there's a lot to throw at you in a short time. So I apologize. But the human trafficking hotline is the one way you can help. It's 888-37 888. 888 37 37 888. That's open 365. Every language is available. And the good news is if you are spooked for some reason and you don't want to give your name, you can do it anonymously. Just give as much information as you can. And how to
Dr.
spot things.
Dr. Schaeffer, at the end of the show, we're going to put the information in it.
Oh,
So
excellent.
we'll be able to, in our description box on YouTube.
Oh,
But
great.
make sure we got the telephone number and everything in it. And what's going to be also important that we get this show to everybody, even send a copy of it to Congress.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. It's the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and it's been around for a long time, and the numbers are just exponentially going up. But the good news is, what that means is people like you, Amos, say, you know, something doesn't look right. I'm in a McDonald's. I see this guy with an underage girl. She's wearing a mini skirt up to her buttocks with no undergarments. And maybe it's cold. Maybe in Florida, that's 60 degrees, but that's cold for us, right? So something doesn't add up. You're like, I'm not sure if it's anything, but let me make that call. There's no downside. You say, I'm in a McDonald's, this location. If you see any tattoos for our sex trafficking victims, tattoos are really important. It's usually a brand by the trafficker. He wants everybody to see it because it's his way of literally branding that victim, saying, this is my property. So the rest of you traffickers don't touch him or her because they belong to me. So that's a good way to kind of identify them. Sometimes I'm a little bit more involved. I'll go out and get the plate without being spotted. I don't want you to interact. The goal of this isn't for you to confront someone saying you're trafficking, because you could be wrong. But even if you're right, this is a dangerous person. And let me tell you, that victim on average brings him or her $250,000 a victim. And the average sex trafficker, for example, has 6 of them working for them. And so you add that up, that's a lot of money, and they're not going to be very happy with somebody trying to stop that. So just report it. That those numbers will go directly to the appropriate municipality in the location from which you're calling, and then they'll do what they need to do. And sometimes it takes multiple tips because some people don't give great information. I see a car, something's going on in it. Can you give any information? It might have been a guy, it might have been a girl. So as specific as possible, but you don't have to be a doctor. In the ER and the places that I've seen these victims, it's pretty obvious now that I know. But the whole reason I do this, as you mentioned in the beginning, it's very unusual for a doctor to get so involved in this fight. I honestly feel like I was called to this 14 years ago. I feel like, how did I not spot this in victims? I've been treating patients for a long time. I've been in the field since the 90s, basically, and we didn't get any education in this because, again, if you remember what I said in the first question, this TVPA Act didn't even come out till 2000. So I was training before we really got to the meat of human trafficking. But it's my goal to train everybody, doctors and just lay people like you who care, to make that phone call. So that's my advice. Make a phone call. It can't hurt you. It takes 5 minutes of your time. And heck, you can save a life, save a life.
But aren't most people, now I'm talking to me personally, I see, I don't mind calling. A lot of people are afraid to call because when they call the police, what's your name, where you're calling from, they ask all the personal information, and people are afraid to get involved for obvious reasons. How do you overcome that? How do you teach?
When you call that hotline and you tell them I have information, I'd like to remain anonymous, and they won't require you to give any detail about yourself. And that's why I'm saying have as many details as you can about the situation, because they're not gonna be able to call you back saying, hey, Amos, you told us this, we want to follow up, what color was the car? So if you're going to do it anonymously, that's fine. I'd rather somebody call anonymously than not call at all. Please help these people. I mean, if it was your daughter or your uncle or just a friend of a family member that you know is now stuck maybe in a child ring, like we see them around here in my part of the world, your part of the world, we have these child begging rings. These kids don't get to go to school. They're moved around and they're selling you fiddle faddle for $10 at a gas station. And the next day they're at another gas station. And then, take a picture of that kid. If you don't want to be on record, you could just say, look, I have pictures. I'll send it anonymously and get it to this hotline number, which is that 888-3737-888. And because there are more things, I know that probably, and we're getting close to wrap up time, I just want to tell people there are things you could do. You don't have to be a physician. You could just take the time out to keep this in your radar, look around. If something doesn't look right, make a phone call and say, I see these people in the fields. They're working literally 19 hours a day in the Florida sun. That can't be right. I mean, most people have protection. They're allowed to take a break. I'm seeing them obviously on a medical side, so I can document a little bit more and I have more time to really engage them. But an average person, you might get one shot at this, but that might be their only lifeline. The other thing you could do, you talked about legislation. I'm nobody. I'm a doctor. I have no business being in legislation. But I got fed up and I said, you know what? The doctors in my state need to know about this, because if they're not aware of it, they're not going to ever treat it. They're not going to recommend resources. So I helped pass this law in Florida that requires all medical people to at least do some CME, which is our continuing medical education. And not just for doctors, anybody who's regulated by the Department of Health here in Florida has to do at least 1 hour. Nurses have to do 2. And that was my way of kind of giving back. So I'm very engaged in the local fight. I'm engaged in the state fight. And then nationally, yeah, I've now gained a reputation where I think I can call almost any senator or House member and say, hey, this is what I'm passionate about. Why do you not care about people raping children or selling adults? And we're back to slavery days. People think slavery went away. Well, some of it did, but modern day slavery is very much alive. We have over 50 million slaves nationally. And I'm not even sure that statistic is correct, because how many of us would say who wants to admit that you've been sex trafficked? It's not easily reported. And when you approach these victims, they tend to deny it because they're so duped. They've been mentally kind of programmed. So they're more afraid of the authorities and police than they are of their traffickers at some point, because this has become the life that they know. It's really pathetic, but it's the reality.
Any other recommendations that you have?
Yeah, I would say get to know your local resources. I guarantee you any big city across any of our 50 states has some sort of coalition. The one I belong to is Human Trafficking Coalition of the Palm Beaches. They do a Zoom presentation every month. You can listen to an expert, either in labor or sex trafficking, or just a resource place that says, hey, you have somebody who needs drug rehab after they've been forced to take drugs and sell themselves on behalf of this pimp. We offer free scholarships for them to come in and get treatment, or we offer GED training for anybody who wants to come out of that life and actually get to go to school, which they should have been in the whole time. So there's a lot of programs. I'm actually on the board of Flight Center, FLITE Center, CENTER Center.org. And I'm not a big fan of endorsing organizations, but the fact that I'm on the board of it speaks pretty highly that I'm very careful. I was watching them do their magic for many years down in Broward. They just moved into Palm Beach County to serve victims here. And they have a federal grant for human trafficking specifically for these kids who've been through things that you and I can't imagine. So, if you're in a position to help, maybe you don't have time, maybe you don't want to call a senator, maybe you don't even want to call the hotline. I don't know why you wouldn't, especially if you could do it anonymously. But you have the means to write a check. Well, help those of us that are helping these kids. We have to feed them, house them, get them a ton of mental health counseling. Obviously, the medical side is a big job. You can imagine these kids have everything from STDs to truly brain trauma from being hit and struck so much. It's just amazing how much you can do as an individual if you want to take the 5 seconds out of your day to think about something other than yourself, because truly I feel like these are the voiceless and they're forgotten. And I'm happy that there's a great movie out there called Sound of Freedom that talks about a true story. My only issue is a lot of these movies show this movement of or trafficking that's happening overseas, and it does happen overseas, but this is happening in our own backyards, and we can't be in denial and say that's a problem in Colombia, or my child is never going to get taken to Guatemala and then sold.
Right.
Well, the truth is it's happening here. It's happening in your schools. I've never been in a school yet where I haven't had to make a report at the end to an FBI agent or to another authority figure saying, we have a problem. This kid is being sextorted and it looks like they may be involved in trafficking. So I'd hate to be negative and say this is a tremendous problem, but it's a tremendous problem that can be solved if everybody spent a couple minutes a day thinking about it. And the fact that you're having me on your show, to me, that's heroic that you even care about this topic. So thank you.
I hope that I can do a lot. By the way, I have a nonprofit organization called Children's Obesity Foundation, which is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. I'm going to put this video on it too. And hopefully people And Deb and my producer, Deborah, she has her own shows, own show,
Great.
and she's did over 2,000 shows. So I'm sure she used to be a social worker. I'm sure she's going to push it because it's for our kids. And
That's great.
if we don't protect them, nobody will.
Yeah, and I would say one final thing, because I was thinking, how else can people help? It doesn't take a lot of time. People are strapped for time. Maybe they're strapped for money, but we all buy products, and we buy products that are cheap because we want a bargain, right?
Right.
But some of those products are so cheap because the supply chain is ridden with trafficked victims. Like, you've heard of sweatshops, but do we think about when we use our iPhone? And I love iPhones. But Apple has been dinged so many times and had to pay so many fines and lawsuits because their components are picked overseas by people that are basically slaves, or your cocoa beans. I love chocolate.
Dr.
75% of
Schaeffer,
my, yeah.
I could talk with you for the next 2 hours and more. I have no
Oh, is
problem.
it time to wrap
We're
up?
running out of time.
Okay.
I want to say to you, thank you for being my guest today. Would you tell our audience how they can reach you or find out more about you? We will also put it on, like I mentioned before, on the description box on YouTube. But
Awesome.
if you have a private number or whatever you think is important, you can give it to
Sure.
us.
The only, honestly, the best way for people to get involved in this and also find me through different means is I would go to htcpb.org. That's Human Trafficking Coalition of Palm Beaches. I'm the former president, but I'm still very engaged. And they can request, let's say they want to have a lecture, that's who you would go to, and they'll come out and they'll do it for free. This is all volunteer. The other one is the Flight Center organization that I told you about. And last but not least, I don't even need my number out there. I want that human trafficking hotline, because they'll walk them through and say, okay, tell me something else or try to do this. It's like almost like a help desk for human trafficking 101. Yeah, that's what I would do.
Dr. Schaefer, thank you very much for your time.
You're
And
welcome.
let's see what I can do to help you, and let's make it happen.
I
Thank
appreciate
you.
you guys. Thank you.